We have, oh, there we go. Tonight we have kind of a different title to our topic of discussion, and it might be a little deceiving in what the topic is actually going to cover. But tonight we are looking at the Wyandotte Purge, and it's basically a time period from 1855 to 1875, which is only a 20-year period in our history. And we've been looking over the history, and this will be the last one that we will dive into tonight. And next month, we will take kind of a different turn and go down into lifeways and the things that our people did. But tonight is kind of the closing of the history portion that we've been talking about for the last several months regarding our departure from Ohio and Michigan and our very brief time that we had in Indian Territory, which became the state of Kansas. So the Purge is looking at a 20-year period that took place. And our topics tonight is it was just business as usual, a hope of reinstatement, and the great thief. And to give you an idea, some of you will probably recognize these faces. There may be a few of you that don't, but these are two of our citizens that we're going to talk about tonight, along with another one, and some of the things that they had done to the tribe during this period of time. To start off with a quote, like I always do, this is the Treaty of 1855, a little snippet from Article 1. It is hereby agreed and stipulated that their organization and their relations with the United States as an Indian tribe shall be dissolved and terminated on the ratification of this agreement, except so far as the further and temporary continuance of the same may be necessary in the execution of some of the stipulations herein. So what that's telling us right there is in 1855, the tribe was terminated, but yet there was going to be a continuation of the tribe until all business was concluded. And when did that happen? July 9th, 1862 was the last piece of business that was conducted by the historic Wyandot tribe. And in the back of the turtle, when I talk about this time period, I tell everybody to grab a Kleenex because this was a very, very tearful type of a moment. It was the last business of the tribe, and it had to have been just something that was just overwhelmingly and emotional. But not quite. It was just business as usual. Jane Barnett, widow of the late James Barnett, deceased, came and presented one order, which was given by council on the 9th day of August, 1860, to Catherine Young, one of the heirs of the estate of Jacob Young, died, amounting to $100, the same having been paid by the said James Barnett in full. A receipt is hereby given to the said Jane Barnett, the order being left with the clerk of the council. Wyandotte Council Room, July 9th, 1862. Boom. The Wyandotte tribe was now officially non-existent. That was the last piece of business. Business as usual. A lot of business was going on to shut down the tribe, and it was just burdensome stuff that was just not fun. It was not glamorous. But then, in the middle of all this business that was going on, there was a lot of other business going on. The Treaty of 1855 was clear, but it was very ambiguous. The Wyandot tribe was going to be terminated, but when? There was no definitive time or date in which the tribe would be shut down. How could Chief Tarami have accepted this fate? How could he have accepted the United States government allowing the tribe to be shut down? How could he have accepted United States citizenship? Well, as we saw back in November, it wasn't Chief Tarami that had basically introduced citizenship. It was done by a couple of other leading men, and he was just the chief that was unfortunately in office the time that all of it came into fruition. So final closure of the Wyandot tribe, as we saw, occurred on July 9th, 1862. After termination, it took 7.5 years for tribal business to cease. In 1855, it became the wish of the United States government to accept the proposal of the Wyandot's leading men. Citizens of the tribe were going to lose their tribal citizenship, and they were going to lose their status as American Indians. I don't think they quite understood that when they agreed to the terms of the treaty. The problem is, not all of the tribal citizens wished to lose their identity as Wyandots and become Americans. For all citizens to have accepted U.S. citizenship meant the name Wyandotte would have been erased from all future history. The name and the people would have literally disappeared off the face of the earth if every citizen had accepted U.S. citizenship. So when Tarabi kind of let everything settle for a bit, in 1857, he began to unofficially negotiate for purchasing land from the Seneca tribe. And when we say the Seneca tribe, we're not referencing the Seneca tribe of upstate New York. We're referencing the Seneca tribe that settled in what became eventually Oklahoma. The Old Mingo, as they were known during their stay in Ohio. The Seneca settled in what is today northeast Oklahoma. And Tarami was beginning to try and see if there was a way that he could purchase a little strip of their land, because he did not want the tribe to just fade away into history. Also in 1857, Matthew Mudeater led a handful of disenfranchised Wyandots to the southern Indian Territory. And it just so happened that that was the same land that Tarami was attempting to purchase. The Wyandots were welcome to live on the northern side of the Seneca's reservation. However, the only Wyandots were allowed to stay were those that had not accepted U.S. citizenship. Matthew Mudeater had accepted United States citizenship, and he was forced to leave Seneca land and return back to Wyandotte City. He couldn't stay because they didn't see him as an Indian, as a Wyandot. They saw him as an American. The former Wyandot citizens that stayed, and there were just a handful, maybe at the most 100, they had eked out a very difficult life amid drought conditions and angry Indians. What do we mean by angry Indians? We were among friends. The Seneca are probably our closest cousins, and some of our most distant cousins, the Cherokee, were also living in the area. Why were they angry? Well, at this time, the United States Civil War was in the making, and lines were being drawn, and the different tribes in Indian Territory were trying to decide who they were going to align with. Would it be the Union or would it be the Confederacy? So there were a bunch of angry Indians walking around, and we were kind of stuck in the middle of it. In 1861, when the U.S. Civil War erupted, the former Wyandot citizens living on the reservation, the Seneca Reservation, were approached by the secessionist Indians. Our host, the Wyandot's host, had aligned themselves with the Cherokee and were going to fight for the Confederacy. The Wyandot people were given a choice to fight for the Confederacy or else. They were given this ultimatum. And our people, they chose the latter. They chose the ultimatum. It's very confusing why they chose to remain loyal to the United States government, because of everything that had just happened a few years earlier. They lost the tribe. They lost their citizenship. They technically didn't have a tribe that they were belonging to, and a lot of people blamed the U.S. government. But they knew back then that it wasn't the U.S. government's fault. It was our own fault that caused that to happen. So they still remained loyal to the government in spite of what happened. Because of their loyalty with the United States government, these former Wyandot citizens, if you will, were placed in house arrest, and they were watched. All of their movements were restricted. They basically became prisoners of war, and they were not allowed to leave the Seneca land. They were not allowed to return back to Wyandotte City. They were imprisoned. However, somewhere in 1862, these former citizens, Wyandotte citizens, escaped their captivity and they returned to Wyandotte City. And this will turn out to be, in 5 years, a major, major event in our history. This is something that a lot of people have very little knowledge of, but that escape in 1862 is monumental. It's a huge thing in our history. In July of 1863, after losing the Battle of Cabin Creek, Captain Henry Hopkins of the Kansas Company B, 3rd Kansas Battery, was angrily limping his way back to Kansas. He got defeated pretty soundly. And his men, on their way back to Kansas, by happenstance, came across the cabin of Chief Tarami. That cabin was positioned somewhere on the bank of Lost Creek, which anybody that's been to Wyandotte knows where Lost Creek is. It's just behind the administration building, and it's just behind the museum. It's down off the side of the bluff. That's Lost Creek. So Tarami was living somewhere on Lost Creek, and at the time of the fortunate event for them to leave their captivity, he left his cabin, but he didn't have the means to take his personal things, and he didn't have the means to take his prized possessions. The prized possessions was a trunk containing an unknown number of our old wampum belts. It was just happenstance. It was just a bad, fateful event that Captain Hawkins' men found these wampum belts and they destroyed them. After the Civil War ended, Tarami went back. Other citizens went back and they tried to recover the belts, but they found all these beads scattered everywhere. The beads were picked up. They were put into bags. They were eventually given to Mary Williams Walker, and she passed those beads down to her descendants. One is in the group tonight, and Bert had given a few years back some strings of these beads, and they now reside in the Wyandot Nation Cultural Center and Museum. So we have some of those beads that are in Wyandotte, thanks to Mr. Walker. Tarami was the Wyandotte's principal chief at the time of the Treaty of 1855. Tarami signed the treaty, but he was adamantly opposed to the treaty and the acceptance of United States citizenship. Tarami honored the old tribal custom of following the majority consensus of the people. Tarami himself did not personally accept United States citizenship. Tarami became a bitter man after the Treaty of 1855 and the expulsion of the former Wyandotte citizens that had chosen to move to Indian Territory and start the tribe all over again. That was going to be the beginning stages of, hopefully, his dream of keeping the tribe going. Tarami, after returning to Wyandotte City, helped form the Indian Party Wyandottes on December 22nd, 1862. By default, Tarami, although never elected, became the acting chief of the Indian Party Wyandottes.
It's going back to find it.
The Indian Party Wyandottes was formed in the home of Abelard Guthrie in the town of Quindaro. In May of 1863, in response to the Indian Party Wyandottes, it just so happens that Matthew Mudeater, Tarami's brother-in-law, he founded the Citizen Party Wyandottes. So we have two brother-in-laws. One had not accepted United States citizenship. The other did. They began to fight among themselves, and they began to try and vie to position themselves as the leader of the Wyandottes, who now, in the eyes of the United States government, technically didn't exist. So, needless to say, Tarami and Matthew had some serious personal issues, especially knowing that Matthew had accepted United States citizenship and Tarami basically had developed a hateful passion for all of his former Wyandotte citizens that had accepted United States citizenship. The battle between the Indian Party Wyandottes and the Citizen Party Wyandottes was very reminiscent the battle between the Christian Party Wyandots and the Pagan Party Wyandots in Ohio before we made the move. But in this particular instance, the battle between the two different Wyandot groups was much, much worse. The difference between the opposing parties, if you will, unlike in Ohio, what was taking place in Kansas became very personal. It was a continuation of the extreme differences found in 1855 when the treaty was signed, but it was just business as usual in 1863 with a very hurtful twist. Tarami became a divisive leader and delivered attack after attack after attack upon former Wyandotte citizens that chose to identify themselves as United States citizens. Tarami became very, very bitter and very revengeful. It didn't matter to Tarami, and it didn't matter to the United States government that many who had accepted United States citizenship recanted their choices and desired to now remain Wyandotte. Matthew was one of them, but it didn't matter. What had been done was done. In 1863, William Walker Jr. declared his support for the Indian Party Wyandots, saying the Citizen Party were no longer part of the tribe. By supporting the Indian Party Wyandots, Walker essentially at the same time declared that he was also no longer part of the Wyandot tribe. He chose to retain his U.S. citizenship. Legally and technically, everything that was happening was a moot argument. For, according to the United States government, the Wyandot tribe no longer existed as an organized and recognized body of American Indians. Yet the government continued to engage the Wyandot in dialogue. For whatever reason, after termination, the Wyandot were still being addressed by the United States government. It makes sense why they did, because by now the Wyandot tribe no longer existed, but dialogue continued. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Tarami just up and moved back to Indian Territory. He left Wyandotte City. Everything he was doing just was set aside, and he just went back home, because now that was what he was preferring to call home. In 1866, William Walker Jr. pulled his support from the Indian Party Wyandots. But that doesn't necessarily mean that William gave his support to the Citizen Party Wyandots. But by default, without Tarami, there was no one else for Wyandot citizens, the United States government, to have dialogue with. So by default, all efforts were now focused from the Indian Party Wyandots over to the Citizen Party Wyandots, and William kind of gave his support for that. Much like William Walker Jr., Tarami held considerable influence with tribal citizens and the United States government. But the big difference between William Walker Jr. and Tarami is William Walker Jr. was well liked by the people. His people adored him, even though he had some questionable things about him. The people did not care for Tarami, but Tarami got things done. He just did it in a very hurtful way. So William was liked, Tarami was not liked, but the two men had incredible influence at the same time. Tarami, the reason he had so much influence with the United States government is he was the last duly and legally elected chief of the Wyandot tribe. Every chief that followed after Tarami up until 1867 were elected as a continuation of the Wyandot tribe after termination. So they were not technically a viable chief for the United States government to deal with. But Tarami was the last one that had been elected, so therefore he was recognized by the United States government. After his move to Indian Territory, Tarami's voice appears to have fallen silent. He just fell off the face of the earth. He disappeared, but maybe not so much as what people want to believe. Silas Armstrong was elected chief of the Citizen Party Wyandots in 1865. With Tarami absent and nowhere to be found, the Indian Party Wyandots were now in a state of confusion. They didn't know what to do. They had no leader. Only the Citizen Party Wyandots attended the United States government's peace conference in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The Citizen Party Wyandots attend, the Indian Party Wyandots do not. The peace conference was held in September 8th through 21st in 1865. And through this peace conference, it brought lasting changes to all of the tribes in Indian Territory. The Wyandot tribe, or the citizens that had made the move to Indian Territory in 1857, were designated at this conference as refugee Indians due to being taken captive, their escape, and their needful search for refuge back in Wyandotte City. With this designation, the door had been opened for the United States government to possibly, they weren't 100% committed just yet, but this opened the door for the United States government to possibly reinstate the tribe. However, during the peace conference, Silas Armstrong became ill. Upon returning to Wyandotte City after the conference, Silas died on December 14th, 1865. Silas had not been a chief with great political influence. He was a millionaire. Silas Armstrong was a businessman by heart, not a chief by heart, and he had acquired for himself what would be equal today to multi-millions of dollars. Silas Armstrong had built his fortunes upon the misfortunes of his own people. Silas was liked by his people because he had money, but he didn't have the influence that others had over the people. Silas Armstrong had chosen wealth and his personal prosperity over empathy for his own people. In 1842, 1843, Silas was chosen to organize the Wyandots' move from Ohio and Michigan Indian Territory. He was a businessman. He could plan things. He had a vision, and he had the means in which to achieve success in those visions. Armstrong made the move knowing there was no land waiting for the tribe. However, Silas had already gone out west, and he had already seen the land that they were going to move the tribe to, and he had pre-chosen his float. His float was chosen at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers. The floats were 640 acres of land given to Wyandot chiefs and leading men as an incentive for them to sign the Treaty of 1842. Silas had been out west exploring the land. He found a great piece of land that he knew his vision for could result in greatness. So he moved the tribe to that same place, and then he claimed where the tribe had actually moved to as his float. It's kind of an awkward arrangement. The land became Armstrong's loyalty and his wealth. At this point in time, all land was communal. All land was owned by all tribal citizens. No tribal citizen owned any land particularly as claimed by them. But in this particular case, Armstrong claimed some land. The spirit of Silas Armstrong, choosing a place of comfort and fortune over the betterment of his own people, was purged from the Wyandot tribe. When the tribe returned back to Indian Territory that became Oklahoma, all land at that point became communal once again. It wasn't until the Dawes Act in 1887 that land was given to individual tribal citizens. Up until 1888, all land went back to the old way. It went back to communal land. Unlike what Silas had done, Silas had claimed land and he had made millions of dollars from that. That mindset of owning land, of owning property, was purged when the tribe went back to Indian territory that became Oklahoma. Ironically, Silas Armstrong was chosen in 1858 to be chief when Chief George Ironside Clark died in office. It's kind of ironic that Silas Armstrong died in office. Matthew Mudeater was chosen to replace Armstrong. With the death of the Wyandot's delegate chief, who had attended the peace conference in place of the Wyandot, the Indian Party Wyandots, the U.S. government was at an impasse. The delegate chief had died. The chief that they had been talking to could not be found. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know who to talk to. But Tarami, even in his absence from Wyandotte City, continued to solicit the United States government for tribal reinstatement. So Tarami was actually still in communication with Washington. He was still getting messages back and forth. So the government did have this continued conversation with Tarami. Whereas on February 23rd, 1867, the Wyandot tribe was reinstated on land seceded by the Seneca tribe, on land that Tarami had tried to purchase for the tribe back in 1857. So 10 years later, Tarami actually was successful in getting land for the Wyandot tribe to be reinstated on. It just came through 10 years of great struggle and under a totally different concept on how he thought he was going to be able to achieve it. In 1867, it became the wish of the United States government to propose reinstatement of the Wyandot tribe. And it makes one wonder, did the United States government offer a reprieve on the mistake they had made in 1855 by reinstating the Wyandot people? It's almost like they had this sense of regret, and they finally made do for what they had made as a huge mistake by reinstating the Wyandot tribe. Tarami was the logical choice. He was the last officially elected chief of the Wyandot tribe pre-treaty of 1855. Matthew Mudeater offered to merge his citizen party with the Indian Party Wyandots, but Tarami refused. The divisive nature of Tarami only increased as he continued to serve as the self-appointed but unelected chief of this newly reinstated Wyandot tribe. Basically, the tribe became Tarami's. In a lot of ways, Tarami became a dictator over what was happening. Because here's a snippet from Article 13 of the Treaty of 1867. If everybody wants, you can read this later, but what I want to read is basically the part that I have italicized and bolded with all capital letters. I'm just going to read that because this is an important part of what the actual article is referring to. All persons of any such person shall be allowed to become members of the tribe except by the free consent of the tribe after its new organization. So what this, the quick summarization here, after everybody was accounted for within the old Wyandot tribe, it was determined in this treaty that people could be allowed back into the tribe by the free consent of the tribe after it became organized. The problem is, this didn't happen initially. The problem is, it was not free consent of the tribe. It became the personal consent of Tarami. Since there was no one contesting him, he chose, Tarami personally chose from all of the Wyandot citizens that had accepted United States citizenship, who he would allow back into the tribe. He became very divisive. He became very angry in who he would allow back in. Tarami's grace was extended to just a very few people. Individuals and families were allowed back into the tribe solely based upon the like or dislike of Tarami. Tarami died on January 15th, 1870, and was buried in the Huron Indian Cemetery. With his death, a breath of life was finally given to the Wyandot tribe. Tarami now rests in the one place he desperately sought to leave, and he never intended to stay, Kansas. Tarami wanted to get out of Kansas. He wanted to be in Indian territory. He chose the land that he wanted as his new home. But while he was in Wyandotte City, he died, and he was buried in the place that he desperately hated. The spirit of Tarami, choosing the worthiness of one's heritage based upon personal likes and dislikes, was purged from the Wyandot tribe. After Tarami's death, this whole spirit of picking and choosing by personal choice who could and couldn't be worthy to be a Wyandot citizen again died. It was purged from the tribe. A whole new mindset was taken. Tarami's successor was John Caraho. On May 30th, 1871, John Caraho became the first elected chief of the Wyandot tribe. That's wonderful. But Caraho's election came with one big monumental problem. Caraho was incompetent. And as we have discussed before, incompetency was defined by the ability to speak English, or in Caraho's case, he couldn't. Caraho speak Wyandot only, which that limited him in his ability to govern, deal with the United States government, and take care of his people. Because of his incompetency, he continued the services of Abelard Guthrie. Tarami had hired Abelard Guthrie and empowered him with a power of attorney to help with the business management of the tribe. Abelard Guthrie, given the power to manage tribal affairs, was also given oversight of tribal funds. With the encouragement of Abelard Guthrie, John Caraho continued status quo. He continued with the employment of Abelard Guthrie, who resided in Quindaro, Kansas, and now business was being conducted for the new tribe in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, from Quindaro, Kansas, which is northwest of Kansas City, Wyandotte City. Caraho attempted to manage tribal affairs in Indian Territory from the state of Kansas. That doesn't seem very efficient, but it was done for a purpose. Abelard Guthrie was an adopted citizen of the Wyandot tribe. Abelard Guthrie was a secretary to John Johnston, the Indian agent that conducted the Treaty of 1842. Our Treaty of Removal was actually partly helped by Abelard Guthrie. Abelard Guthrie moved west with the tribe, and he quickly married Quindaro Nancy Brown, which she was the granddaughter of Adam Brown. Abelard Guthrie was an adopted citizen, and with his adoption, he was given full access to everything within the tribe. It was though he was a naturally born citizen. Abelard Guthrie, unlike other citizens, was many others. We see that there's a few that sought a fortune, but Abelard Guthrie was always seeking his fortune. He was always scheming and scamming to try and make some money. He actually tried to go after his mother-in-law's inheritance, who was Shawnee, tried to get her land. But Abelard Guthrie traveled west in 1849 with the Wyandotte mining expedition. Unfortunately for Abelard, he did not find his fortune in California. In 1852, Abelard Guthrie was elected as the first delegate to Congress for the provisional Nebraska territory. Abelard Guthrie's hopes for political fame and fortune was dashed when he lost his delegate status. He was not reelected to go to Washington, D.C. His political career stopped immediately. Then, in partnership with Joel Walker in 1855, Guthrie founded the town of Quindaro, named after his wife. Abelard Guthrie had hopes that Quindaro would bring him fortunes as a boomtown and a Kansas gateway to the West. Well, it didn't happen. By 1860, Quindaro was just another ghost town on the Kansas prairie, and Abelard Guthrie was bankrupt and heavily in debt. But thankfully, John Caraho retained the services of Abelard Guthrie, and he continued with his power of attorney. It just so happens that about this same time, his fortune was found. The railroad was being made across the new Wyandotte Reservation, which meant that the railroad company, was paying the tribe for access across the land. And that money was significant. The purpose of working out of Quindaro, Kansas, with Chief Caraho and Abelard in tow, was that they were immune to tribal oversight, where nobody was there to watch what was going on, or so Guthrie thought. Abelard Guthrie began to divert tribal funds from the railroad into his personal accounts to pay his personal debts. Don't underestimate the Wyandottes. What Guthrie did not take into consideration was John Wesley Gray Eyes was living on the new reservation. He had been there for quite some time. He knew the business of the tribe. He knew what was going on. He was an attorney himself, and he was very astute. John Wesley Gray Eyes found out what was going on. John Wesley Gray Eyes knew that the tribal council didn't exist. There was no tribal council to give oversight. He had a suspicion that things were going on because Abelard Guthrie had a history. So John Wesley Gray Eyes sought the counsel, the personal counsel of William Walker Jr. and Russell B. Garrett. So we have now, again, two competing sort of pseudo governments. We've got Caraho in Quindaro, and we've got Gray Eyes down on the reservation. But one is being very noble in the affairs of the tribe, while the other is not. So John Wesley Gray Eyes discovers Guthrie's crime. He figures out that Guthrie is embezzling tribal funds, and that ceased. John Wesley Gray Eyes made a plea to the United States government to divert all funds away from Abelard Guthrie and put it back into the hands of the people. It went back down to the reservation rather than up in Quindaro. On January 13th, 1873, Abelard Guthrie died of heart failure in Washington, D.C. as a result of her husband's crimes. Quindaro, Nancy Brown Guthrie, was banished, and she was forbidden to seek adoption into the Wyandot tribe. She was basically given the decree of outlawry. She could no longer associate herself with the tribe because of the severe, heinous crime that her husband had done. He had taken untold thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of dollars. The spirit of Abelard Guthrie, choosing to embezzle tribal funds while stirring and deflecting chaos away from himself and what he was doing, was purged from the Wyandot tribe. In 1872, Thomas Punch was elected chief of the Wyandot tribe, defeating John Caraho for a second term. After suffering defeat, John Caraho self-banished himself to live the life of a traditionalist. Fortunately for John, he didn't know what Abelard was doing. So he was innocent of the crimes of what Abelard Guthrie was doing to the tribe. In his grief, John Caraho just went away to live the life of a traditionalist between the Wyandotte Reserve and the Seneca Reserve. And he will become a very important person in our history in 1911 and 1912 when Charles Maurice Barbeau meets him. It was not until July 11th, 1872, that the Wyandot tribal government and the council was able to be strong enough and stable enough to govern the tribe. There had been so much chaos. There had been so much embezzling. There had been so much misappropriation of funds. There had been so much lack of dealing with the United States government for anything to happen. From 1867 to 1872, the Wyandot tribe was in chaos, basically, best way to say it. They didn't know what was going on. There was no one there governing. However, by 1875, in a true display of integrity and inclusiveness, Matthew Mudeater, the former chief of the Citizen Party Wyandots, was elected chief of the Wyandot tribe. The Wyandot purge of keeping invasive white ideologies out of the Wyandot tribe was painful, but very necessary. Successful tribal government requires a lot of forgiveness. Successful tribal government requires a lot of inclusiveness. Successful tribal government requires watchfulness from the people. The people have got to be invested in their own tribal government. But when, in the case with Abelard Guthrie, he removed tribal government from the people, they have no idea what was going on. But thankfully, John Wesley Gray Eyes knew what was happening. It was known from experiences over the last 10 years that the Wyandots in both Kansas and Indian Territory, that if Wyandots were allowed to stay in both locations, communication and unity would become an impossible challenge. After all, the Cuyahoga Council was unsuccessfully trying to manage and govern the Wyandots' affairs in Indian Territory from Quindaro, Kansas. To make matters worse, I do not doubt that rumblings and grumblings from the state of Kansas were making Kansans' intentions clear. Indians were not welcome in their state. A complete and total move of the Wyandot tribe south in Indian Territory was the only way to protect and preserve the lives of each citizens. Much like being banned from your clan for the crime of outlawry, if you did not move with the Wyandot tribe, a blanket of protection could not be extended. So, the purge was painful in that a lot of the ideologies that had crept into the tribe from the days of Ohio, with that constant and continued contact with the Americans, the British, and the French, had to go. That purge took place over the course of 20 years, which ultimately allowed for the reinstatement of the Wyandot tribe in Indian Territory that became Oklahoma. If all of that had been carried down to Oklahoma from Kansas, it's highly doubtful that the tribe could have survived. All the politics, all the greed, all the hate, all the nasty that was going on had to be taken from the tribe for any hope of a chance of the tribe to survive. It was a painful time, 20 years, but it worked, because here we are today in Wyandotte, Oklahoma, and around the world, still very much identifying ourselves as Wyandots. So our grandparents had to go through a lot to ensure our continuation in our existence today. May we never have to do anything like they did in our future, anytime, anywhere. So, as usual, sources, and that's all. That's the Wyandot Purge. Any thoughts? Any questions?
I know Caraho was one of the main speakers when Barbo came down to Wyandotte. But interestingly enough, I don't know if he married into the Seneca Cayuga. He must have or something, but anyway, his descendants are not Wyandotte. They are on the Seneca Cayuga roll.
Right.
And which Gabe is a very good friend of one of them. And so he was just like, well, I want to switch over to Wyandotte, but because his descendants were not on the 1937 roll, they're not able to switch back over to Wyandotte. So it was there, he kind of purged himself and his family as well.
Yes, he did. Even though he was innocent of Abelard's crimes, can you imagine the guilt, the remorse
Yeah.
that he had to bear for the rest of his life,
Yeah, I'm sure.
knowing what was done?
Yeah.
That would have been horrid. But thankfully, he had a chance to not redeem himself, but show the integrity of who he was as a man and what he had accomplished by moving down and isolating himself. Because if it wasn't for a lot of his work, the songs and the language that we have today would have been
Right.
much more difficult to have retrieved.
Right.
So we're grateful for that.
Absolutely. So I didn't know that about Nancy Brown. So she was, how do you say it? Like
She,
banished?
she, yeah, she was basically given the crime of outlawry,
Okay. So,
which
but her children obviously weren't,
no, she personally,
just
no,
her.
just her personally. Yeah.
Okay, because she's like buried like somewhere in Kansas between, it's almost like near Fort Scott or something, like under a tree, Chief said.
Hmm. Yeah, there were 2 degrees of outlawry, and it was very rarely used. The first degree of outlawry was basically banishment. Not only were you banished, but you also were struck, you were stripped of your identity as being a Wyandot. The decree of outlawry was rarely used, but it was used under extraordinary circumstances or what was deemed at the time extraordinary. And I'll just say, the last time that I know the crime of outlawry was judged upon somebody was my uncle,
Yeah.
just a few years ago. Because Jim
But
Bland,
before then, it was probably a long time, right?
the last one that I'm aware of was
Was-
Quindaro Nancy Brown.
Yeah.
It's a rare, rare, rare event that outlawry is judged upon a tribal citizen. But the heartache of losing your identity as a Wyandot and losing your citizenship is just, it's tough.
Absolutely. And
And
but
then the second
oh,
degree of outlawry, every tribal citizen is required, if they see this person that has been banished, this individual has a death sentence. They have done something so great, so extreme, so horrid that not only are they banished, but they are sentenced to death. So that's the
wow.
first and second degree of outlawry. And thankfully, it's rarely, rarely, rarely used within the
Yeah.
tribe.
Mm.
But the purge was intending to eliminate from the tribe all these ideologies that were brought into the tribe by the Europeans. And they were brought in by men and women that had been adopted into the tribe. And they were brought in by leading men who had interacted so deeply and intimately with the Europeans that it just became second nature to them.
Yeah.
It became anything and everything that was totally against the ideologies of who we were as Wyandot people and American Indians. It had to be released before the Wyandot tribe could be reestablished in Oklahoma. Tough times.
With that, Lloyd, I just met a Jim Lee from the Shawnee tribe, and we were talking, and he said that when we moved in 1843, let me see if I can pull this up. Um, dang it. He was told by Henry Harvey, a Quaker missionary and interpreter, with the Shawnee for decades. When the Wyandots were preparing to move to Kansas, they wanted the Shawnee and Delaware to give them land. They actually asked for the best land that the Shawnee had. Peter Cornstalk, who was a war chief at the time and a nephew of his fourth great grandfather, Silver Hills, was living in Kansas, and he and other were adamant that they not get any land. He was one of the Missouri Shawnee who were against giving them land, while the Ohio Shawnee, who had not been in Kansas long, were willing to give it up. There were several days of very heated discussion over the matter, and Henry Harvey wrote down the dialogue. Apparently, the Missouri Shawnee told the Ohio Shawnee that if they gave up any land to the Wyandot, that they would kill the head man who voted for it. Eventually, the matter was settled, where the Wyandots would get nothing from the Shawnee, at least not what they were asking for. According to the Wyandot chiefs, they had given land to the Shawnee at one point in the past, which is apparently not the case. Peter Cornstalk said he must have been asleep a long time because he doesn't remember them doing anything for the Shawnee. I was
Um,
told that it was the land agent that wouldn't allow the Shawnee to give that land up. So this was kind of a new thing to me, but that was the arrogance of the leaders back then.
yeah, well, first of all, the Shawnee was living in Ohio as guests upon our land.
Yes.
And that can be absolutely confirmed because in one of the treaties, I don't recall just right off which treaty it is, but it is made very clear that the land that we had given the Shawnee in Ohio cannot be given back to the Americans, cannot be given to the Americans because we still lay claim to it. That's expressed in a treaty.
Okay.
So for the Shawnee to say that we never gave them land in Ohio is just, it's craziness because they would not have survived without the gesture of one of their friends. And the
Right,
Shawnee are Shawnee is one of the nations that we never went to war with, but we almost did because they gave up the land that we gave them in Ohio.
Oh, okay.
And the land in Kansas and Indian Territory that they had negotiated with, I had the understanding that the Shawnee basically backed out of it because they felt that if they had gone through with the treaty, that would have incited the United States government and they would have had some reprisals to deal with. I've not heard that story that you have just told there, where there was this contrasting opinion between the two different bands of Shawnee. I've not heard that before.
Well, I just wanted to bring it to your attention because this is what I guess the Shawnee members tell on their side.
That's fine. We've got our story that we tell too. So, and ours can be documented by treaty.
Okay. Do you know what treaty that was?
I'd have to go back and look. Not right off.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
A lot was going on at that time. A lot of very indecisiveness, and a lot of people were scared, and a lot of people were losing everything that they had. And if you can imagine what it'd be like today if we were put in that same position, how tumultuous life would be for all of us. You never knew from one day to the next what was being done that was to your advantage or disadvantage. Any more thoughts or comments? Okay, Kim, I guess we're done.
All right. Let me
And-
stop recording.